Hi, PerspectiveWeather.com meteorologist Paul Orion here on Tuesday, August 18th. Some rather quiet and comfortable weather for the next few days in the Mid-Atlantic region, the Northeast U.S., the Great Lakes, thanks in large part to a high-pressure system that will be in control of the weather. I thought we'd focus in on the tropical scene in the Atlantic Basin. This is, of course, a time of the year where things generally start to really ramp up, generally reaching a peak in the middle part of September and then slowly ramping down through the latter part of September and through the month of October. We had two systems last week that developed briefly into tropical storm status. That would be Kyle and Josephine, and both of which didn't last all that long and really never had a chance to impact the U.S. East Coast because of the upper air pattern. We now have two new systems that we're monitoring, and both of these can certainly threaten areas around the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico over the next several days. And we'll point out some of the upper air features that we'll be watching over the next few days. This is the official map from the National Hurricane Center with not one but two different systems now that we're monitoring. One already in the Caribbean Sea right in this region. This is the 5-day expected forecast track, and this is out in the central part of the Atlantic, and this too will move in a general west to northwest direction, and looks like this is the main area of concern over the next several days with these systems, and we'll kind of talk about why I believe that's the main area of concern when we take a look in a minute or two at the upper air pattern. I'd like to look at the 500 millibar anomalies to see where the highs and lows are setting up aloft to kind of get an idea as to where these systems might proceed over the next several days. But again, we now have two new systems to closely monitor as we push through the second half of the month of August. Well, here's kind of a global mosaic of the tropical region from the CIMSS University of Wisconsin website. We're looking at an IR imagery loop for the last 2 days, and the two features are quite interesting. First of all, you'll see the development right in the last few frames right here of a rather small looking tropical wave, but indeed that is the front tropical wave that we are monitoring in the eastern part of the Caribbean Sea, and it looks like it'll continue to move towards the region between the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico and the western tip of Cuba. It may eventually spill out over into the Gulf of Mexico, and again, this is the front system right here that we will monitor over the next several days. Really, there's kind of two separate waves here. This right along the 40 west longitude line is system number 2. Notice another wave right on its heels, and it'll be interesting to see how these really interact with each other over the next 48 hours or so, or 72 hours or so. This second wave that we're monitoring will continue to move to a west-northwest, probably on a little bit more northern track of the front system right now over the eastern Caribbean. But again, I think generally this is the area of concern, the Florida Peninsula and the Gulf of Mexico over the next 5 to 10 days or so. Well, one of the indexes that like to monitor, especially this time of the year, but really throughout the year, is called the Madden-Julian Oscillation, and it represents the location of a tropical disturbance that propagates to the east over the tropical part of the world, and depending on what phase the MJO is in, can sometimes give us a heads up as to what kind of temperature and precipitation pattern you can expect to see, let's say here in the central and eastern U.S. This time of the year, MJO in phases 1 and 2 generally result in more active tropical activity in the Atlantic Basin. Maybe the opposite in the Pacific, and the Western Pacific has been very quiet for the whole season so far this year. But as we can see here, the green represents the forecast, in this particular case from the European model right here, the ECMF European model. Green is the forecast from today on through the end of the month of October. And the main thing I want to point out here is the MJO Looks like it's headed to phases 1 and 2, and that generally is an active tropical period for the Atlantic Basin. And indeed, we have two systems that we'll monitor right now, and given the status of the MJO headed for those active phases, it looks like there very well will be environmental conditions that are quite favorable for these two systems to perhaps intensify, and for perhaps additional systems right on their heels. And we saw that third wave moving into the central part of the Atlantic. So again, the MJO is suggesting a couple of weeks here at least of some active weather in the tropical Atlantic. Well, as I said a moment ago, the MJO tends to have an effect on temperature and precipitation patterns around the world. And what we're looking at here is kind of a composite of the MJO for given times of the year, in this case the May to September time period, for the particular phases that the MJO is in. And this phase 2 right here, you see all this blue here, that actually represents sea level pressure that is below normal when the MJO is in phase 2 this particular time of the year. And by the way, it's the same sort of pattern in phase 1. And notice here, this is the Mexico right here, this is South America right here, and we see a lot of blues. In other words, a lot of below normal sea level pressure, again indicating active tropical time period in the Atlantic Basin, from the central Atlantic all the way to the Caribbean Sea and into the Gulf of Mexico right here. In fact, you see kind of a dark blue. This happens to be the Gulf of Mexico region right here. So again, this is suggesting that phases 1 and 2 will be quite active, potentially active, and indeed we have a couple of systems that we're tracking now, and I expect quite an active remainder of the month of August going into the early part of September, the way the MJO is setting up in phase 1 and then phase 2. Now, in terms of where there perhaps may be the most vulnerability to getting hit by these tropical systems over the next 5 or 10 days or so, one of the things I like to look at, in addition to the MJO, for example, is the 500 millibar height anomaly pattern, to see if there's high pressure ridging that sets up, let's say, over southeastern Canada. That typically opens the door for perhaps the southeast coast to get hit by tropical systems, in addition to Florida, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Caribbean Sea. But we'll go forward here and watch what happens. We have a pretty extended area of upper level trough extending from the southeastern part of Canada into the south central part of the U.S., again providing cooler than normal weather conditions in places like D.C., Philadelphia, New York City, but very hot out in the interior west, record-breaking heat, high pressure ridging centered right over the interior western U.S., a desert southwest. So very hot out there, but a little bit cooler than normal across the eastern U.S. These are 5-day averages. This is the current 5-day period. Let's just move forward here over the next week to 10 days or so and see what happens here. Here we are now at days 7 to 11. This is actually August 24th to August 29th, even a little farther out. Notice very strong upper level trough remains over southeastern Canada. Not much over the southeastern U.S., Florida, the Gulf of Mexico. And this is the reason I think it's certainly less likely that any kind of tropical system will impact the mid-Atlantic region or the northeast U.S. over the next week to 10 days, given the fact that there's going to be upper-level troughiness continuing to exist over the next several days, maybe the next week to 10 days or so, a general west to east flow. But when you get down to this region right here, notice very little in terms of winds and hardly any heights showing up here. This is perhaps the most vulnerable area to get impacted by these particular tropical waves, and maybe any additional tropical waves over the next week to two, maybe right through the month of August. Florida, Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean Sea. This is the area of concern, and I think that's what the 500 millibar height anomaly forecast maps are telling us. The mid-Atlantic up to the northeast U.S. probably not all that much of a concern. Of course, nothing is set in stone, but this is the area to watch over the next several days, and we'll certainly keep an eye on it here at PerspectiveWeather.com. That's it for now. For PerspectiveWeather.com, I'm meteorologist Paul Dorian.